When most people think about witch hunts, they imagine some evil old crone stirring a cauldron in a dark forest. But here's the thing that'll blow your mind. The vast majority of women burned as witches weren't practicing any magic at all. They were just trying to make a living. I spent months digging through historical records from the witch trial era, and what I found is absolutely disturbing. These weren't random acts of religious hysteria. They were calculated attacks on specific groups of women who posed economic or social threats to the established order. Let me paint you a picture. It's 1580 in a small German village. There's a woman named Agnes who's been delivering babies for 20 years. She knows which herbs stop bleeding, which ones ease pain during childbirth. The local priest doesn't like that women go to her instead of praying for divine intervention. But here's where it gets really dark. Agnes has just successfully delivered the mayor's wife's baby when the town's other midwife, backed by a rival family, accuses her of using unnatural methods. Within weeks, Agnes is on trial for witchcraft. Her crime? Being too good at her job. This pattern repeats thousands of times across Europe. The women they called witches were predominantly midwives, herbalists, brewers, and healers, essentially female entrepreneurs of the medieval world. They had knowledge, they had clients, and most importantly, they had economic independence. Consider the brewing industry. Before the witch hunts, brewing was almost exclusively women's work. These alewives were respected members of their communities, running profitable businesses from their homes. They used yeast, herbs, and traditional recipes passed down through generations. But as urban centers grew and guilds became more powerful, male merchants wanted control of the lucrative beer trade. Suddenly, these successful businesswomen found themselves accused of using supernatural means to make their beer so appealing. The pointed hats they wore to be visible at markets? Now evidence of witchcraft. The economic motive becomes crystal clear when you look at property seizure laws. In most regions, when a woman was convicted of witchcraft, her property was confiscated. Her house, her tools, her savings, everything went to the local authorities or accusers. It was legalized theft on a massive scale. I found records from Würzburg, Germany, where the prince-bishops' witch hunts targeted the wealthiest women in the region first. One case involves a woman who owned 3 houses and a successful textile business. Her accusers? Her business competitors and a nephew who stood to inherit if she died. The medical knowledge these women possessed made them particularly vulnerable. In an era before formal medical training, these healers knew anatomy from assisting in childbirth. They understood the properties of plants and could diagnose illnesses that baffled others. But this knowledge was double-edged. When their treatments worked, they were accused of using supernatural powers. When patients died despite their efforts, they were blamed for causing the death through curses. They literally couldn't win. Take the case of herbalists. These women maintained gardens with dozens of medicinal plants. They knew that willow bark eased headaches, that digitalis could regulate heartbeats, that ergot could induce labor. This knowledge, accumulated over generations, was branded as devil's work. What's particularly tragic is how the witch trials decimated folk medicine knowledge. Generations of accumulated wisdom about healing plants and techniques was lost forever as the women who carried this knowledge were executed or forced into hiding. The timing of accusations often reveals the true motives. Harvest failures, economic downturns, or political upheavals would trigger waves of witch trials. Communities needed scapegoats, and these independent women were perfect targets. They were visible, successful, and lacked male protection. Religious authorities provided the justification, but follow the money and you'll find the real motivation. In Scotland, Kirk records show that accusations of witchcraft spiked whenever there were disputes over land inheritance or trade privileges. The profile of accused witches varied by region, but certain patterns emerge everywhere. Widows were disproportionately targeted because they retained their deceased husband's property without male oversight. These women often continued running businesses or trades that others coveted. In England, I discovered records of cunning folk, traditional healers and fortune tellers, who served their communities for decades without issue. But when economic tensions rose or new religious authorities arrived, these same respected figures suddenly became dangerous witches. The persecution of female brewers is particularly well documented. As brewing shifted from household production to commercial enterprise, women who refused to abandon their traditional role faced systematic harassment. Their success was reframed as supernatural influence over customers. Even skills that seem mundane today were twisted into evidence of witchcraft. Women who could predict weather patterns through natural observation, who understood animal behavior, or who had uncanny success with crops were viewed with suspicion by those who couldn't match their abilities. The accusations often followed predictable patterns. A woman would be successful in her trade for years, building clientele and wealth. Then economic conditions would change, competitors would emerge, or she'd have a dispute with influential neighbors. Suddenly, her success was reframed as supernatural. Court records reveal how accusers retrofitted normal events into evidence of witchcraft. A successful midwife would be blamed for every difficult birth she'd attended over decades, and herbalists' failed treatments would be recast as intentional poisoning attempts. The geographical distribution of witch trials also tells a story. Regions with strong guild systems and growing commercial competition saw more trials. Areas where women's traditional roles remained unchallenged had fewer accusations. It wasn't about religious fervor, it was about economic control. What makes this even more sinister is how the legal system was rigged. The burden of proof was reversed. Accused women had to prove they weren't witches. Torture was routinely used to extract confessions. Even acquittals often resulted in social exile and economic ruin. The ripple effects extended far beyond individual victims. Entire professions became masculinized as women fled traditional roles to avoid suspicion. Medicine, brewing, and even certain crafts shifted from female to male-dominated fields during and after the witch trial period. Some women tried to adapt by working under male relatives or joining religious orders, but even these strategies weren't foolproof. Nuns who were too knowledgeable about herbs or who showed unusual abilities could still face accusations from within their own convents. The psychological impact on communities was profound. Women began self-censoring their knowledge, avoiding practices that might be seen as suspicious. Generations of accumulated wisdom about healing, agriculture, and traditional crafts began to disappear. When you map the decline of women's economic participation against the timeline of witch trials, the correlation is stark. In regions where trials were most intense, women's participation in trade, property ownership, and skilled professions plummeted and took centuries to recover. The most chilling aspect is how ordinary this violence became. Communities that had lived peacefully for generations turned on their most knowledgeable women. Neighbors testified against neighbors, friends betrayed friends, all in service of eliminating economic competition. Understanding this history changes everything about how we view the witch trials. They weren't religious events or supernatural phenomena. They were calculated campaigns to eliminate women's economic independence and traditional knowledge. The witches were entrepreneurs, healers, and skilled professionals. So the next time someone talks about witches, remember Agnes the midwife, the alewives with their pointed market hats, the herbalists with their healing gardens. They weren't magical. They were just women who dared to be successful in a world that decided their independence was too dangerous to tolerate. And that, perhaps, is the most horrifying truth of all.